Right, diving right in today, we're going deep on the capability approach, to this framework that kind of reframes how we think about well-being, shifting things away from just like the stuff people have, the resources, and more towards what they can actually do, the freedoms they have to achieve a life they value.
Yeah, and think of this deep dive as like a philosophy special. So if you're into philosophy, this one's for you. We're going to really dissect the capability approach. Like, how does it fit in with all the big questions philosophers grapple with?
Exactly. And our main source for this philosophical journey, if you will, is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Specifically, their entry on the capability approach. It's pretty comprehensive, lays out the basics, digs into some of the debates, and even talks about where this whole approach is being applied. Pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, it is. So for all you philosophy buffs out there, our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack the core ideas of the capability approach. We'll look at the philosophy behind it, what it means for how we think about things like well-being and freedom and even justice. And, we'll get into where it maybe falls short too.
Okay, so let's get into this. Where does this capability approach even come from?
Well, Amartya Sen. He's like the big name, kind of the pioneer, bridging the gap between economics and philosophy. Martha Nussbaum is another key figure. And of course, a whole bunch of other scholars have built on their work. But what's interesting is that the capability approach didn't just appear out of nowhere. It came about because some folks weren't satisfied with the traditional ways of thinking about well-being, especially in economics.
So like going against the grain a bit.
Definitely. Sen, for example, wasn't a fan of utilitarianism. That whole focus on maximizing happiness, usually tied to resources, didn't sit well with him. And he also had issues with what's often called resourcism, which, as the name suggests, is all about how material goods are distributed. His argument. They both miss something crucial. They don't consider the many different ways people can actually do things and be in the world, even with the same resources.
Okay, so they're missing the actual lived experience, you could say.
Exactly. That's where functionings and capabilities come in. Functionings are those things people actually achieve, the states of being and doing. And capabilities are the freedoms people have to achieve those things. It's not just about having a right to something on paper. It's about whether you can really, truly exercise that right.
I see. So it's about like whether you actually have the opportunity to put those rights into practice, not just whether they theoretically exist.
Right on. The capability approach is saying, hey, let's not just focus on the stuff people have. Let's look at what they can actually do with it. Because, as Sen pointed out, just giving people resources doesn't automatically make their lives better.
So two people could have the same amount of money, for example, but their lives could be completely different.
That's the idea. He actually used a really powerful example. Imagine someone with a disability who has the same income as an able-bodied person. On paper, they look equal, right? But think about it. The person with a disability might face all sorts of barriers in converting that income into a good life. Maybe their environment isn't accessible, or they have to spend a lot of their income just to get around, like on a wheelchair. So even though they have the same resources, their chances for well-being are just not the same.
Yeah, that's a really clear example of how just focusing on resources misses the bigger picture.
It really does. And that's where conversion factors come in. These are the things that affect how well a person can turn resources into actual functionings, into those achieved states of being and doing. It could be personal stuff like your metabolism or your skills. It could be social stuff like societal norms or discrimination. Or it could even be environmental, like the infrastructure where you live or even the climate. All of these things can make it easier or harder to translate resources into a good life.
And this all plays into Sen's critique of utilitarianism too, right? He had some pretty interesting thought experiments to illustrate his points.
Oh, yeah, he did. Remember the pleasure wizard?
That's the one who could be perfectly happy with very little, right?
Oh, exactly. And then you have the hard-to-please person who needs a ton of resources just to feel a tiny bit of satisfaction.
And Sen's point is that utilitarianism, which is all about maximizing overall happiness, could end up being pretty unfair in these scenarios.
Yeah, because if all you care about is the total amount of happiness, you might end up giving less to people who actually need more, simply because they're easier to satisfy.
So even if everyone's technically happy, the distribution of resources could be wildly unjust.
Right. And Sen also pointed out that people living in poverty often develop coping mechanisms. They lower their expectations just to get by, but just because they've learned to be content with very little doesn't mean their situation is just. Utilitarianism can completely miss that nuance.
But the capability approach sees that. right?
Yeah.
It doesn't just look at happiness levels. It looks at whether people have the real opportunity to live a decent life, regardless of how happy they say they are.
Exactly. And it recognizes that people have different needs and face different challenges. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. It asks, what are people actually able to do and be in their lives given their unique circumstances? That's a much more sophisticated way of thinking about well-being.
Okay, so now we've got a good grasp of some of the key ideas behind the capability approach. But is it like a full-blown theory, or is it something else?
Well, that's a good question, and it's actually been debated quite a bit. You'll see people use different terms: capability approach, capabilities approach, even capabilitarianism. There isn't really a hard and fast definition, which I think adds to the appeal in a way. It's more like a flexible framework, a set of tools that can be applied to different problems.
So it's less about having all the answers and more about asking the right questions, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry talks about three main ways the capability approach can be used. You can use it to assess individual well-being, to evaluate how societies are structured, and even to design policies for social change.
And what ties all these applications together?
The focus on what people can actually do and be. It's about their real lives, their actions, their experiences, not just their income or their possessions or even their subjective feelings.
So Nussbaum, she kind of broke down these applications into two main categories, right?
Yeah, she did. She talked about using the capability approach for comparing quality of life between different groups of people and for developing theories of justice. And she even came up with 5 principles for putting the approach into practice, though there's some debate about whether all 5 are strictly necessary.
And then you've got scholars like Robbins, who see the capability approach as more of an open framework, like a foundation that can support different, more specific theories.
Right. So you could have Nussbaum's theory about justice alongside another theory that focuses on the capabilities people need to participate in democracy, for example. And they would both fall under the umbrella of the capability approach because they share that core focus on, well, capabilities and functionings.
So even though there are different flavors of the capability approach, they all agree that capabilities and functionings are what really matter when we're talking about well-being.
Exactly. They're the building blocks of a good life, a life worth living.
Okay, so let's get into some of the nitty-gritty of the capability approach. There's this debate about what kinds of doings and beings should count as capabilities and functionings. Should we only focus on the good stuff, or should we include things that are negative or even neutral?
That's a big one, and it really gets to the heart of what we value. The argument against limiting capabilities to just the positive stuff is that it can make us miss some important things. For example, even if someone has a lot of opportunities to do good things, their life could still be pretty bad if they're constantly facing threats or oppression, things they can't avoid.
So it's not just about what you can do, but also about what you can't avoid.
Exactly. And then there are things that might seem bad, but that we need to study to understand the world. Like domestic violence, for example. If we only focus on positive capabilities, we're excluding things that are really important for understanding how societies work.
So it's like we need a more neutral view of capabilities, right? A capability is just a freedom or opportunity to do or be something, regardless of whether we think it's good or bad.
Yep, that's the idea. So someone might have the capability to be well-fed, which is a good thing, but they might also have the capability to harm others, which obviously isn't good. And there are even capabilities that seem pretty neutral at first, like choosing between different brands of laundry detergent. But imagine if one brand turned out to be toxic. Suddenly, that seemingly trivial capability becomes really important. The point is, we shouldn't assume we know what's relevant or irrelevant beforehand.
Now, another big idea in the capability approach is that these capabilities are real freedoms. But the Stanford entry warns against thinking this is just about a free market, right?
For sure, Sen definitely sees markets as important, especially for economic development. But his idea of real freedoms is much bigger than that. It's about having a genuine opportunity to do something, not just having a right to do it on paper.
Like, you might have the right to vote, but if the polling station is miles away and you have no way to get there, you don't really have the freedom to vote.
That's it. And real freedoms take into account all the things that can get in the way, all the obstacles that can prevent you from actually doing something, even if you technically have the right to do it.
And those are the conversion factors we talked about earlier, right? The personal, social, and environmental stuff that can affect your ability to turn resources into the things you want to do and be.
Yep, they're all connected. And those conversion factors can create real needs too. Like, if most jobs in your area require you to have a car, then having reliable transportation becomes a real need, not just a want.
It's like those needs are shaped by the context you live in, not just by some universal list of what humans need.
Precisely. It's all about what you need to function in your specific society, to have the freedom to live a good life, as you define it.
And all this is built on a really important philosophical distinction, the distinction between means and ends.
Absolutely. The capability approach is saying that capabilities are the ultimate ends. They're what we should be aiming for when we make decisions about public policy, for example. We need to be asking, how will this policy affect people's capabilities? Will it give them more opportunities to live the kinds of lives they value?
So instead of just focusing on how much money people have or what kind of stuff they own, we should be looking at what they can actually do and be with those things.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, it's not the means that matter most, it's the ends.
Ah.
What can people actually achieve in their lives? And different capabilities might require different kinds of support, not just money. It could be things like access to education or healthcare, or even a safe and healthy environment.
And this is one of the main criticisms the capability approach levels against other theories, like resourcism and Rawls' idea of primary goods. It says they get the priorities mixed up.
Yeah, because they focus on the means rather than the ends. They assume that if you have enough resources or enough of those primary goods, you'll automatically be able to live a good life. But the capability approach says, hold on, not so fast. People have different abilities to convert those means into the things they actually want to do and be.
So it's not enough to just focus on distributing resources fairly. We need to make sure that people can actually use those resources to achieve the things they value.
Right, and that brings us back to human diversity. The capability approach recognizes that people have different needs, different goals, and different abilities to convert resources into well-being.
So it's really pushing back against the idea that there's one right way to live a good life.
Exactly. It's saying that what matters is that people have the freedom to choose a life that's meaningful to them within the limits of, not harming others.
And it's got a lot of praise for that, particularly from feminist philosophers and disability rights advocates.
For sure. They've been pointing out for years that traditional theories often ignore the experiences of people who don't fit the mold, people who are marginalized or have different needs.
So how does the capability approach actually account for all this diversity? There were a few points in the Stanford entry, if I remember correctly.
Well, first, it looks at a much broader range of things that people might value. It's not just about having enough money or a good job. It also includes things like social relationships, the ability to care for others, and having a voice in political decisions.
Right, because those things can be just as important for well-being, especially for certain groups of people.
Exactly. Second, it takes those conversion factors seriously. It recognizes that people differ in their ability to turn resources into functionings. And third, it acknowledges that people have different goals and values. Sen distinguishes between well-being freedom, which is about the freedom to pursue things that are good for you personally, and agency freedom, which is about the freedom to pursue goals that might not directly benefit you, but that you believe are important for other reasons, like fighting for social justice.
So, you might choose to make less money in order to work for a cause you care about, even though it means sacrificing some of your own well-being.
That's a good example of how agency freedom can come into play.
Now, when it comes to actually comparing well-being across different people, what does the capability approach say we should measure?
Well, for realized well-being, it focuses on functionings. Basically, what has a person actually achieved in their life? What are they able to do and be? And for freedom, it looks at capabilities, those opportunities to achieve well-being. The idea is that these functionings, from basic things like being healthy and well-nourished, to more complex things like having meaningful work or participating in your community, are what really make a life worth living.
It's about what you've actually managed to do and be in the world, not just what you could theoretically do.
Right. And it emphasizes the importance of looking at the whole set of capabilities someone has, not just individual ones in isolation. Like, a single parent might have the capability to work and the capability to care for their children, but do they have the whole set of capabilities they need to do both those things well in a way that fits their values? It's about the big picture, not just isolated snapshots.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But how do we actually put the capability approach into practice? You can't just be about saying capabilities are good, right?
Oh, definitely not. It gets pretty tricky. The Stanford entry goes into all sorts of complexities. For example, The purpose of your analysis matters. A capability approach to environmental justice might need to draw on different philosophical ideas than one focused on health justice, and the purpose will also shape which specific capabilities you focus on.
Makes sense. So you're tailoring the approach to the specific problem you're trying to solve.
Exactly. And then there's the whole debate about whether we should focus on functionings, the things people have actually achieved, or capabilities, the opportunities they have.
Yeah, that's a big one. What are the arguments on each side?
Well, for capabilities, the big argument is that it respects people's freedom. It lets them choose how they want to live their lives rather than imposing some predetermined set of outcomes. It's also seen as more in line with the idea of personal responsibility. But some folks argue that we can't completely avoid paternalism, making decisions for others, especially when it comes to things like basic needs. And then there's the practical side. Functionings are usually easier to measure than capabilities. You can observe whether someone is healthy or well-nourished, but it's harder to measure their opportunities to be those things.
So it's a trade-off between respecting people's choices and making sure everyone has what they need to live a decent life.
Right. Sen actually came up with this idea of refined functionings, which tries to bridge the gap. A refined functioning is an achievement that includes an element of choice. So choosing to fast for religious reasons is a refined functioning, while starving because you don't have enough food isn't. It's a subtle but important distinction.
Okay, so even if we can agree on whether to focus on functionings or capabilities, we still need to figure out which ones are important, and then how do we even compare them?
That's where things get really complicated. Some people argue that, ideally, all capabilities should count. But in practice, we have to make choices. We have to decide which capabilities are most important for the specific issue we're looking at. And there are different approaches to doing that. Some people, like Iris Marion Young and Elizabeth Anderson, focus on capabilities related to democracy and social equality. Martha Nussbaum, on the other hand, has her famous list of central human capabilities, which she sees as basic moral entitlements.
And she's pretty adamant about that list, right?
Yeah, she believes those capabilities are essential for human dignity. But others, like Amartya Sen, are more hesitant to come up with a fixed list. They think it's better to let communities decide democratically which capabilities they value most. And that leads to another debate. What does it mean to have reason to value a capability? Is it about individual choice, or about having a good process for making decisions, or about some objective standard of what's good for humans?
So even figuring out which capabilities to focus on is a philosophical minefield.
It is. And then you have the issue of weighing different capabilities. How do we decide which ones are more important than others? Nussbaum says we shouldn't even try to make trade-offs between her central capabilities. She thinks they're all equally important and that we should set minimum standards for each one. But others think we need some way to weigh them, whether that's through democratic voting or by looking at how much they contribute to people's overall happiness.
Seems like there's no easy answer there.
Nope. And it gets even more complicated when you realize that some capabilities might be complementary, meaning they work better together. Like the right to vote is more meaningful if you also have freedom of speech and access to information. So it's not just a matter of adding up individual capabilities. It's about understanding how they interact and reinforce each other.
So it's a very holistic way of thinking about well-being and justice.
Definitely. And that brings us to the question of whether the capability approach can be a theory of justice in itself.
Because it doesn't seem like it is, at least not on its own.
That's right. The Stanford entry makes it clear that the capability approach offers a valuable way to think about justice, but it doesn't automatically tell us what a just society would look like.
It gives us the tools to analyze justice, not necessarily the blueprint for creating it.
Exactly. Nussbaum gets closest with her idea of guaranteeing minimum thresholds for her central capabilities, but even she calls her theory partial and minimal. And Sen, as usual, is more focused on the process of identifying and addressing injustices, rather than defining an ideal of perfect justice.
So there's room for different capability theories of justice depending on what you prioritize and how you interpret the core ideas.
Absolutely. And the Stanford entry lays out some of the key things any capability theory of justice would need to address. Like, how do you justify your principles of justice? Do you focus on outcomes or opportunities or something in between? How do you choose which capabilities are relevant, and how do you measure them and compare them? And how do you deal with the issue of individual and collective responsibility? Lots of big questions still to be answered.
Sounds like there's plenty of work to be done for philosophers who are interested in the capability approach.
Definitely. And it's not just limited to Western philosophy either. There's growing interest in connecting the capability approach with non-Western traditions like Maori philosophy, Ubuntu, and Buen Vivir.
So it's becoming a truly global conversation.
It is. People are using the capability approach to think about indigenous rights, environmental justice, and even the relationship between humans and nature. And it's raising some really interesting questions about whether the approach itself, with its emphasis on reason and deliberation, is compatible with different cultural values. Definitely a lot more to explore there.
And even beyond these big theoretical questions, the capability approach is being applied in all sorts of practical areas.
Yeah, it's everywhere. Development, ethics, public health, education, climate change. People are using it to think about human rights, disability rights, and even animal rights. It's really having a huge impact.
So for our philosopher listeners who might be new to the capability approach, what would you say are the most important things to take away from all of this?
Well, first, it offers a really fresh way of thinking about what makes a good life, a life worth living. It shifts the focus away from just material resources and asks us to consider what people can actually do and be in the world. It recognizes that freedom is complex and multifaceted, and it's very sensitive to the fact that people have different needs and face different challenges. Yeah. It also gives us some powerful tools for thinking about justice and for working towards a more equitable world.
It's not just an abstract theory. It has real-world implications.
Exactly. And for philosophers specifically, I think the capability approach offers a really rich and challenging set of ideas to grapple with. It connects with so many of the classic philosophical questions about the good life, freedom, and justice.
So to wrap things up, what's the one thing you'd like our listeners to ponder as they go forth and explore the capability approach further?
Think about how it might intersect with your own areas of philosophical interest. How could the capability approach help you understand the issues you're already working on? What new insights could it offer? Because I think this framework has the potential to really shake things up in philosophy, and I'm excited to see where it goes from here.
That's a great challenge to leave our listeners with. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the capability approach. We'll see you next time.